Hello, welcome to this edition of Incidental Sociology. I'm Wes Cheek, a PhD in sociology and a researcher at Ritsumeikan University. So, on this edition, we are going to look at, and I almost hate to do this to you, um, internet virus Ben Shapiro, and talking about gender. And the reason I want to do this is not because I want to give him any more views, but because when I'm giving a lecture in class and I show a video on anything having to do with gender issues, I often get the following video pop up in my recommendations due to the algorithm. And I worry I haven't seen any, there might be some I'm not aware of, good kind of sociological breakdowns of it. And I'm going to do a really simple one today to give you some suggested readings of things you might want to look into if this video bothers you or if you don't have answers to it. So let's look through this really quickly. But first, before we get into the video itself, I want to remind people and refer people back to the excellent book Caliban and the Witch by Sylvia Federici, which I recommend highly to you. It came out in 1998. It is about the formation of capitalism and mainly how that affects women and through colonialization affects oppressed people. So the reason I think that's important for this is whenever you're watching one of these videos or reading something by people associated with the internet dark web or the or intellectual dark web, sorry, not the internet dark web, the intellectual dark web or people of that sort, I think this is the important thing to always keep in mind is this section. So Federici says here that indeed the political lesson that we can learn from Caliban and the Witch is that capitalism as a social economic system is necessarily committed to racism and sexism, for capitalism must justify and mystify the contradictions built into its social relations. And that's the important line there that I want you to always keep in mind. And that's whether consciously or not what figures like Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and even Steven Pinker, people like this, are doing. They are justifying and mystifying the contradictions built into social relations of capitalism, and that's why they prove to be useful, right? Because where capitalism is failing as a system, they gloss over that by naturalizing problems or mystifying problems for us, okay? So I want us to keep that in mind when we're going through this talk. And I'm going to do a video later going into more detail about Caliban and the Witch, because it's a work we should really go into. So this is the video that I always get popping up when I'm giving a lecture, and it's Ben Shapiro destroying or ethering or in some other form yelling at a young woman at a university. And we know that's kind of the target audience that Ben and people like him aim for, because they're people generally who don't have the training or background yet to be able to deal with his style of rhetoric. So let's look what he says in this clip and then work through that.
Boy Scouts. Because this is a very because for all of human history, boy meant boy and girl meant girl. Boy did not mean girl. And if I call you a moose, are you suddenly a moose? Okay, if I redefine our terms. No, yes, that's right. Men and women are a completely different thing. This is true. Have you ever met a man or a woman? They're completely different.
You say you're a cat. It's not a thing. It's genders. It's not saying you're.
Okay, why is that? I don't understand. Why? Okay, let me ask you this. Okay, I won't ask you how old. I will ask you how old you are. Okay, because you're young enough that it's probably not insulting to ask you. So.
I'm 22, so I'm probably only naive, right?
No. Why aren't you 60? Why aren't you 60?
Visit.
And why can't you identify as 60? What is the problem with you identifying as 60?
It's not the same as gender. You can't just.
You're right. Age is significantly less important than gender. You can't magically change your gender. You can't magically change your sex. You can't magically change your age.
You can still legally change it. People recognize.
You can't legally change your age, by the way.
All right. So this is an incredibly dumb argument, but it gets a lot of attention. You can hear people yelling "oh" in the background and applauding, but it is an incredibly silly point. And I want to go into why it's an incredibly silly point in a second. But I first want to point out that you have to realize that what Ben Shapiro is doing here is being essentially using a patter, like a magician's type of patter. You can think of him as the pen part of pen of Penn and Teller, right? He's not the Teller part who has the ability to actually do things. He's the Penn part who talks over and glosses over all the things that are going on. Or if you think about David Blaine doing a magic trick, he's the kind of off-putting weird part of David Blaine that enables him to do a magic trick, right? And it's important to realize, like, Ben Shapiro's background is a law school grad, so what he's skilled at doing is using rhetoric to kind of argue a point that's already decided. I don't think his rhetoric's that great, but it's sufficient when you are arguing with people who aren't prepared to have the argument with you, right? It's a very superficial way of doing it, but it works for YouTube videos. It's very easy if you're not thinking through it. But he's not really thinking through it here. It's a very easy way to deconstruct this point. Before we do so, I do want to mention, and I want to go into this further in a more in-depth video, that even the point that he's trying to make about gender is a very shallow point. If you go back all the way back to 1949 and read one of my favorite works on the topic by Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, where she addresses this even in the introduction about what do we mean by a woman? Do we just mean a womb? Are people without wombs not women? Do they have to have a uterus? Is that a woman? Or even if we agree that all females are human, that if femininity is in jeopardy, then what does that mean? Does it mean that it can change, that someone can change from being female? If they become women, do they stay women, right? She really explores this in detail, just even in the introduction. So if people that support Shapiro or Ben Shapiro himself are interested in reading, there's a whole massive body of literature on this that they're skipping over. But that's not the point I want to get into today. I want to get into an even easier point. Ben Shapiro makes the comparison here between age and gender and insists that an age is something you can't change, just like a gender. And he's wrong on both points, clearly. The easiest example of this is that we have leap years, right? In fact, this year, 2020, is a leap year. And if you know anything about leap years, you know that it's to adjust for flaws in the way we are able to kind of measure and calculate and put into practice our measurements of actual phenomenon, right? So we say that a usual year is 365 days, and we measure a year by the time it takes the Earth to travel around the sun. But the Earth doesn't accurately, exactly travel around the sun every 365 days, right? It's different than that. And we have to compensate for that difference by every 4 years, we insert a day, and that's a leap year. That's to compensate for that difference between the measurement of the actual Earth's movement around the sun and our kind of calendar year, right? And it hasn't always been measured that way, right? It's changed over the years, and it's changed in systems in different ways. So we started adding this year under the Gregorian calendar. There's other ways of doing this. There's longer cycles of doing it. It's been done differently in other cultures that also realize there is this different in measurements. But what does that mean? If time is flexible to this adjustment, what does that tell us? How does this analogy that Ben Shapiro is making break down? Well, it tells us that time, to a certain degree, is also a social construct, right? And I want to be very particular about what I'm saying there. To say that something is a social construct, you've probably heard that term, and it often gets abused and ridiculed. But it's an accurate way to look at these things, right? So we're not saying that somehow human beings push the Earth around the sun, or that the Earth doesn't revolve around the sun, and that we just made that up and say it, and it's a social construct. It's no, there's a natural phenomenon, but we choose how we interpret and reflect that, right? And there's room around the margins of that natural phenomenon to define it and to choose what aspects of it we highlight and what we don't, right? And how we choose to interpret the year is it's 365 days, but as it's not an accurate measurement, we also have a leap year, right? I think that's simple enough to understand. But what does that mean? Even that we made that adjustment from the Gregorian calendar, well, what does that mean that we can change calendars? I thought time wasn't a social construct. I thought it didn't change. The first set leap day happened in Rome under the Julian reforms in the 1st century BC. So if we can define and change these things throughout the course of our society, what does that actually say about time, right? And so if you see there, the analogy between gender and time starts to break down in the way that Shapiro means it, or for us to build it up in terms of saying that it is in fact a social construct. Right? I hope that makes sense up until now. So here's the thing. If your birthday falls on leap year, right, what does that mean legally for you? What does that mean culturally? What does that say about your birthday? So it turns out it depends, right? It depends on where you live and what the legal standing is in that country as to how as to what your birthday is going to be. And does that mean that laws aren't a social construct? Well, laws are kind of one of the most basic social constructs that we have, right? We make up what the law is. We decide, we get together and decide what the law is, right? And all of the power structures and everything else that goes into a society goes into that. So your birthday and when it falls, if you're born on the leap day of the leap year, February 29th of a leap year, the local law where you live decides on what day you were born, right? So your birthday is adjustable, and what month you were born in, what day you were born on, how old you are on either side of that birthday does depend on this social construct, right? There's famous people who were born on leap year. One of my personal heroes, Pedro Zamora, born on leap year. Everyone's fashion icon, former soccer player Taylor Twellman, born on leap year. Trump supporting underwear model Antonio Sabato Jr., born on leap year. Alex Rocco, who everyone knows from his role in Teddy Z, or maybe from the Godfather films, born on a leap year. Dinah Shore, these are all very current references, by the way. The kids are going to love these references. Born in a leap year, right? So what does that mean for them? Are they really, after 20 years, are they really 5 years old? Because February 29th, logically, if we think about it, right, there's no getting around it. There's no arguing. If you're born on February 29th, your birthday only comes around every 4 years. So every 20 years, they turn 5 years old. Or do we, as people that acknowledge that these things aren't exact measurements, right? That they are social constructs, that we have to work around these kind of idiosyncrasies and these kind of gaps in interpreting the natural phenomenon, do we realize and compensate for the fact that, no, of course they are not 5 years old. Of course they are 20 years old, even if their birthday doesn't occur so much. In Ben Shapiro's argument, he would have you believe that we don't think that way, right? That time and gender are both rigid, firm things that are scientific, natural phenomena that we understand and they're exact, and you have to pick one, right? But that's not how it works. And I think we can all see that that's not how it works. Interestingly, the odds of being born on February 29th are 1 in 1,461, or around 0.6%, right? And I don't want to make this connection too much, but a survey from 2016 from the Williams Institute estimated that 0.6% of U.S. adults identify as transgender. Now those survey results could move as being transgender becomes more acceptable. They could be inaccurate. It's a hard thing to measure, right? But needless to say, the thing we have to understand from this, and I guess Ben Shapiro's argument here is applying to people who are transgender, even though he doesn't state that explicitly here, is that even though being born on a leap day in a leap year are not the absolute kind of normative measurement and phenomenon in our society, right? Not statistically normative position, right? Either of them. But they're both experiences that happen to people. They're both very real things. They're both things that millions of people will experience in their lifetime throughout our history, right? And so they're not something that exists outside of that, right? It's a significant part of our human experience. And not to hit you over the head again with the analogy, because they're different things, but insisting that because of a specific measurement that you've decided as the absolute, that someone is a boy or a girl, or that someone is born of this age or that age, right? There's a lot of room around the margins of those things. Even at the least extreme form of that argument, there's a lot of room around the margins for it, right? They're open to societal interpretation, and we choose how to define those things. I hope that makes sense, right? So we choose how to define those things. So just as units of time are not simple as measuring the Earth revolving around the sun and rotating around its own axis, your sex is not as simple as boys have a penis and girls have a vagina, right? Much less gender. If you speak to any kind of a neurosurgeon or someone who does advanced medicine, they know these things. They know there are all kinds of different ways to formulate these things, right? If that's hard for you to understand, think maybe about constellations, right, of stars. To say that constellations are social constructs, I think is a pretty easy thing to understand, right? Taurus and Gemini, Pisces do not actually exist in the sky. These are not actual real things, right? Based on how we look at the stars, we construct how they are. But stars are real things. Stars are real things. We just choose from our perspective what arrangement to put them in and what to call them. Right? And that changes. That changes throughout the ages. It changes throughout time. So just as stars are real, but constellations are social constructs, right? Um, kind of the movements of time, right? The passage of time and the measurements of time are real, but the way we choose to characterize them, interpret them, are social constructs. And the same with gender, right? Okay, so I would also want to point out, and we can go into this one more when we do a video on time itself. But there's a great book called The 7 Day Circle by Zerubbabel. It was written in 1985 about how flexible time is, in fact, and how we kind of use time and change time depending on the social circumstances. So he says that dramatic political changes are often accompanied by equally radical changes in the social structuring of time, right? So, in the establishment of the length of the week and its diffusion throughout the world, religion was clearly the dominant force, right? 7 days is there's no actual measurement of phenomenon, right, that gives us 7 days. We decided on that, right? And in 1792, the French actually changed to going on a 10-day decade, right? So instead of the week, they switched to 10 days. And it's really interesting what happened there, right? There's a big conflict between the political structure enforcing the 10-day week and kind of the cultural structure pushing back against it, right? And in fact, it was kind of the religious cycle of the week that won out. And a great quote from that time is, "Sunday has existed before you and it will survive you." Also, the Soviets under Stalin switched to a 5-day week to try to increase production because they had all this heavy equipment around for industrialization and realized that it would make more sense to keep it operating all the time. So if people were on 5-day schedules, 5-day week schedules, they could alternate days off and keep the equipment running all the time instead of having everybody off on the weekend. That also didn't end up working out for various reasons. One of them being that families often found that they didn't have the same days off, right? It made things complicated. So what we're looking at here is that Shapiro's argument is flawed, right, in two very big ways, right? A, that his assumption that time is a purely natural phenomenon with no social component, and B, that gender is a purely natural phenomenon with no social component, right? It's actually, we see that both those things are not true, right? They're not purely natural at all. They both have social aspects. So while Ben Shapiro thinks that he's making a good argument in comparing gender and time, he's actually making a good argument for us and demonstrating how they're related as social constructs. Does that make sense? I hope that kind of makes sense to everyone. Well, that was the brief video with recommendations to readings for you that I hope you check out. Zerubbabel, Frederici, and de Beauvoir. I would check those out if I were you. And that has been this edition of Incidental Sociology. Thanks.